Hey, Derek.
Hey, Diane.
So, we have to do a certain amount of research to prepare for all of these podcasts. So, tell me the truth. Have you ever used an AI tool to help you with that research?
Well, to be honest, this is actually my AI generated avatar speaking to you right now. Actually, no, the truth is yes. I have been known to use some chatbots from time to time to help with some of my research and prep for these episodes.
Well, I have done the same thing, I have to confess, but with appropriate fact checking afterwards, of course. So, if you and I are using AI for these kinds of day to day projects, have you ever wondered who else might be using AI in their day to day work? Like maybe the government?
I hadn't really thought of that, but now I am. Should I be worried?
Possibly you should, but fortunately, our next episode of the podcast features someone who can help us answer that question. I had the great pleasure to speak with Jennifer Raso, who is a law professor at McGill and an expert at the intersection of regulation and law and the use of AI. So she asked questions like, how do governments use AI to do their work? Is that a good or a bad thing for citizens? How do governments regulate AI? And what responsible AI even means for all of us?
Well, that sounds really interesting. I can't wait to listen to it.
Well, I think it should be great, and if you even want to, you can use ChatGPT to generate a summary afterwards.
I think I will. Let's cue up the interview.
Welcome to Mark My Words. I'm Diane Fagan. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Jennifer Raso. Professor Raso is an assistant professor at McGill University's Faculty of Law, and she studies how humans, technologies, and institutions together produce decisions, including how AI affects government processes, which we'll talk about a little bit today. So, Professor Raso, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get into some of the questions we're going to talk about, I'll start by asking just a little bit about you. What's your background? Where are you from? And how did you wind up studying administrative law, which I think, not too many people who are little kids are like, I want to be an astronaut or I want to be an administrative lawyer. And how did you land on this focus professionally on technology and decision making specifically?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great set of questions. I think certainly when I was a child, I wasn't thinking of administrative law. I didn't know it existed. But I certainly understood the impact of the administrative state on everyday people, including my family. So I'm describe myself as pan-Canadian. Lived almost in all parts of the country, all corners of the country. And one of the things that I did before I went to graduate school was I worked as a lawyer with the City of Toronto. And again, there I saw the impact that the law has on people every day, especially in things like social benefits administration, in permitting, and even in policing and challenging policing practices. And I realized that all of those are areas of administrative law. So administrative law is, very broadly speaking, the law that governs how public officials or administrative agencies ought to treat everyday individuals. And it sets out principles about what a fair process ought to look like and what an appropriate or just outcome is. And this really, in my view, is at the core of kind of everyday impacts of the law today. Most of us never will go to court if we're lucky, but we will experience filing our taxes. We might receive a parking ticket that we disagree with. Some of us might be targeted by the police for stops that we feel are unjust, and so on and so forth. Many people experience admin law through immigration and so on. And these are all examples of law being brought to life by administrative officials. And they really matter for everyday people. So this was really what drove me to this area of study.
Well, I think it's super interesting in part because in different ways, the administrative state itself is this kind of opaque machine that I think many of us intersect with but don't really understand or don't feel we have a lot of access to. And in some ways, I mean, technology is a huge term, but certain kinds of technologies have the same feeling. There's something that's governing huge parts of our lives, including government, but we don't really understand it. So thinking about those things and being able to think about the material impacts is kind of an interesting thing to talk about. So your work focuses on a number of aspects of technology. Technology can be lots of things, but I want to focus this conversation on AI specifically, which I think, a lot of us are fascinated by, maybe scared by, maybe excited by, maybe even bored with hearing about on podcasts and other places. But maybe you can just kind of give us a broad view of what are some of the most pressing issues in your mind when you think about how governments are engaging with AI. Engaging with can mean both how they use it, but also how they're trying to regulate it.
Yeah, so I mean, AI, of course, is something that we hear about quite frequently in Canada. Now we have a minister of AI. And of course, there's always regular reports of how AI is going to take over a certain industry or kind of reduce the need for workers in particular areas of the economy. But when it comes to administration, of course, AI is something that is being used ish. Like there's a little bit of confusion as to what degree AI is used at all in certain areas, with immigration being a really great example. But nonetheless, whether it's AI or whether it's an algorithmic system, there are concerns that arise about, I would think, the underlying principles or values that are driving the adoption of these tools. For example, AI systems, so those would be systems that kind of learn from data and generate outputs or decisions, are often introduced with an assumption that they're going to help optimize a decision-making process or make it faster, and perhaps even generate better outcomes. But of course, better for whom is a good question to ask. And optimization in whose interest is another important question to ask. So, if you have fast but wrong decisions or decisions that are generated quickly, but people feel like they've been treated very unfairly, that's not necessarily good for government. It's not good for democratic stability either. So I think these are questions that drive a lot of the work that I do and are things that we ought to be thinking about when governments are adopting AI. And when it comes to AI regulation, of course, sometimes the regulation of AI is framed as a thing that's impossible, in part because when we're thinking about what AI is in that context, it's described in a way that's so vague as to be ungovernable. So by that, I mean, if we were to say, let's govern the environment, for example, what is the environment? Like, what are we talking about here? And the same type of problem happens with AI. Are we talking about AI in policing, for example, in identifying who should be investigated? Are we talking about AI when it comes to its impacts on energy usage? That's something we can regulate. So these are some of the problems that I think face regulators when they're seeking to undertake the regulation or governance of AI from the outside. In other words, there's a sense that that AI is kind of everything and nothing because it's defined so broadly. So that's another way that I think about the work that I do and try to explain the task at hand when I chat with administrators and people who are involved in regulatory work.
Those are both really interesting dimensions, and I want to come back to the second of those,
Yeah.
the kind of how regulation functions and maybe this sense that AI is just this kind of impenetrable thing that might be a limiting factor. But I want to come back to the first, which is how governments are using AI for their own processes. I think it might be helpful to look at a couple of examples. So you mentioned a variety of things, including, policing and immigration. I wonder if you could give us one or two of the examples you've come across where the Canadian government in particular is really using AI or trying to use AI right now, and what some of the impacts, positive or negative, have been of those experiments so far.
Yeah, so I think this is a really, it's a useful way of making sense of things and looking at particular examples. One area where there's been proposals to use, whether they call it AI or algorithmic systems, is in immigration. And immigration is a prime area to be targeted by AI and other types of digital tools, in part because it's an area of administration that's seen huge numbers. So here we have, tens of thousands of applications for visa approvals for different types of citizenship or permanent residency status, for immigration, other immigration statuses, refugee approvals, and so on. And we also have this as an area where there's typically a lot of appeals to decisions. So there's a real significant interest from the government's point of view to speed things up, to reduce backlogs, but also to ensure that the mass volumes of applications that they have can be dealt with relatively quickly and efficiently. A system that's been in the news every now and then is one called Chinook, which is used for visa applications. And it's been in the news because, first of all, there's a question about whether AI is used or not here. The government will say, well, this isn't AI at all. It's a spreadsheet system. So Chinook enables visa application reviewing officers to do what's called batch processing of visa applications. But it does so by showing them the visa applications in spreadsheet form. So instead of looking at individual files where you would have the evidence submitted by the people who are requesting a visa, their reason, and so on, instead, people and their applications are seen as cells in a spreadsheet. And AI is used or not, it's an open question, to populate some of the cells in that spreadsheet and to flag some individuals as risky visa applicants. And this system enables visa officers to, in theory, review and approve or reject visa applications within a series of minutes rather than maybe half an hour or more. So on the one hand, this is an efficiency win, but on the other hand, especially from an administrative law perspective, there's questions about to what degree this type of system really changes the hearing experience, really changes the sense that visa officials might have about impacting people versus impacting cells on a spreadsheet. And questions too about if AI is being used to generate risk scores, for example, to populate data pulled from documents into these cells on the spreadsheet, how accurately is it doing that? What are some of the biases that might be built into the system, and so on. So this is a tool that's top of mind for immigration lawyers in Canada. It's one where there's very different views about the usefulness of this tool, whether you're on the side of the immigration bureaucracy in Canada or whether you're working with visa applicants. But it's led to a deep sense of, I think, concern among advocates who are working with folks applying for visas that they're no longer being treated as individuals or even being heard, but rather being processed in batches in ways that really rubs against some fundamental commitments in administrative law.
I want to come back to something that you alluded to a little bit earlier, because I think it's kind of an interesting question that both impacts very directly the kinds of things we've been talking about so far, but also engagement with AI in a kind of broader social sense. I think often when we're talking about AI, we're given the impression that this technology is just so complex and so vast, and it's moving so fast that nobody other than technologists can really understand it. So whether we're citizens, whether we're regulators, you can't be expected to really, know how to deal with AI because it's just too much. And I think in some of your work, you've kind of warned against this narrative about AI, that's this sort of mystery that we can't penetrate. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why that's so persistent and who benefits from keeping AI in this sort of realm of techno mysticism.
Yeah. So, I mean, AI as magic is something that's been happening for a while. And I think that way of not just thinking about AI, but of describing AI occurs for a few reasons. I think from a very, if you're looking at things from an economic point of view, oftentimes the kind of magical AI is, there's press releases to the media with that way of describing AI when big firms are trying to drum up capital for future investment into the things that they're doing. So there's, I think, a self-interested motivation there by some of the biggest AI firms, from OpenAI to Anthropic and so on. But of course, there's a second reason why I think we have AI described as magical And that is related to regulation. And it's connected to something I said earlier, which is if AI is magic, then how can anyone regulate it, right? If it's just floating around, unmoored to anything in this world, acting on its own in ways that we cannot explain, then it becomes impossible for anyone except perhaps the folks who are designing the AI to do anything about it. And I think that that also is a significant move politically. And it's one that I like to have my students and my classes think about, that I ask administrators to think about when they're thinking about how to regulate or control AI as well. An alternative, of course, is to think about AI as something that's grounded in this world. For example, AI systems don't just float around in space. They are connected to cables, they use power, they're trained by people who live in particular places, and there are so many different ways that regulations could be used, and especially regulations that already exist in those kind of grounded locales. And I think the real question for regulators is to, first of all, remember that those regulations exist, but then to think about how maybe they need to be reshaped or reimagined to regulate in ways that are connected to how AI is operating in the world. So that's what I like to, that's a strategy I like to use when I'm describing AI with my students, when I'm talking about it with my colleagues, and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about AI as existing on a continuum of technology, and therefore a continuum of regulation and other ways we engage with technology, rather than this thing that's just so separate from anything that's ever come in the past that we can't, that everything has to be reinvented from the ground up.
Yeah.
So you've also written at times about ideas of responsible AI, which is something, a way of describing a set of ideas that we hear all the time, including looking at the Montreal Declaration for Responsible Development of AI, which is a document that emerged a few years ago here. I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about what people mean when they talk about responsible AI. What is that set of ideas really referring to? And in a general sense, whether we're getting closer or further from that, or even if that's a useful way of thinking about it at all, I guess.
Yeah, so responsible AI, for listeners who might not be familiar with the term, of course, is a way of thinking about AI governance that became popular maybe about 8 years ago or so. And it's a term that was used by technologists in a number of different places to really articulate a set of values or goals that they thought ought to govern them and their community of AI developers, essentially. And in that way, responsible AI is not too different from a lot of other corporate social responsibility initiatives that we've seen, like, for example, what's sometimes called greenwashing, but firms taking on environmental commitments, like increasing, the use of plastics that are recycled in the products that they're producing, for example. But with that in mind, responsible AI is also a movement that has sought to avoid regulation. In other words, by saying, oh, we can create responsible AI, we can govern ourselves, part of what's happening there is signaling to outside regulators, governments locally, all the way to nationally or even internationally, to say, you don't really need to worry about us, we're doing it ourselves. Interestingly, or maybe disturbingly, with some of the shifts that have been happening in the United States recently, where there's been aggressive moves federally to try and prevent states, for example, from regulating AI, and there's been a kind of hollowing out of any commitments to regulation that had been made by the previous federal regime. What's happening, it seems, is an emboldening of the heads of largely US-based tech giants who see now that because they have a kind of deregulatory government in the Trump administration, that they no longer need to make these commitments to responsibility in the first place. So what has been happening is that a lot of the responsible AI bodies that have been created by different entities, US-based firms, like Google and so on, is that they're starting to become thinner and thinner. So web pages that might have been dedicated to responsible AI initiatives are disappearing. Different types of internal regulatory bodies within these corporations are also disappearing as well. And so I think there's a, it's an open question today as to what degree of responsible AI is still a thing at all. And so I think that that's one of the challenges that arises with self-regulation, of course, is that it depends on the goodwill of folks working within a corporation. And if anything, what's been happening, especially in the past few months, should signal that there's a need for responsible AI regulation from the outside by governments, by international organizations, and so on.
So one of the things that one of the reasons I was interested in talking to you is that I think the optic of thinking about this from a legal and regulatory point of view isn't always the first place people go if you say, who's talking about and thinking about AI as a large concept or technology. And it sort of makes me think about the fact that one of the opportunities that exists in a university like McGill is that we have people looking at these technologies from a million different angles. You have, basic computer scientists, you have political scientists, you have, people working in law, you have people working in the social sciences. There's all these different dimensions of this that are getting looked at the same time. So I wonder if maybe you can talk a little bit about how you collaborate with people within the university and outside of the university, and how bringing all these different perspectives to bear could be a kind of advantage in being able to get into some of these really pertinent issues we've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think McGill is a really great place to be doing AI-based research because there's such a rich community of scholars here, and also graduate students and undergraduate students who are really interested in digging into big challenges like what do we do with AI, and who are open to being surprised at what they might learn from another discipline. So AI raises challenges that cannot be solved if you just look to one discipline like computer science, or even if you just look to one discipline like law. And a lot of the work that I do draws on the history of science and technology, draws on sociology, digs into computer science literature as well, to help us better understand this phenomenon and to connect it to the past to get a sense of where we might be going in the future. The great thing about McGill is that there's folks working in computer science and engineering, there's folks working in medicine, in the education faculty, even in music as well, who are really interested in exploring the AI question from all of these different angles. And so I've been very fortunate to have those conversations with people here through initiatives like the McGill Collaborative on AI and Society, which I'm a member of, which is really trying to set a strong foundation for this community of AI researchers and for exploring these types of questions from all angles now and into the future.
Yeah, I mean, that feels, sometimes when I'm thinking about these broader social issues, I'm thinking, what role do universities play? And when I think about this, that's one of those things that universities are a bit uniquely positioned to do. And another thing universities do is obviously we're a place that teaches students, and students are both thinkers and leaders of the future and also citizens. So I guess one last question I'll ask you is, you've raised a lot of things that are potential areas of concern in terms of how AI might be being used to inform systems that have an impact on all of our lives from a government point of view. What should we as citizens be sort of doing to keep an eye on this, to understand how it impacts our own lives, to maybe advocate for things we believe in this area? Just outside of your professional life, what do you think we all ought to be considering in this realm?
Yeah, when it comes to AI, I would say being skeptical is good. So the reason I say that is that, of course, it's easy to get caught up in the magic of AI. And it's also easy to become romanced by the vision that there's this tool that can make your life so much easier, that can remove the responsibility you might have to make difficult decisions, that can also make it seem as though content is being created as if by magic on your computer screen. And perhaps, as you might warn somebody who's at a magic show, it's good to ask questions about how the illusion is being produced. And so I always encourage my students, but also family members, friends, to be thinking about where these things are coming from. What is the environmental impact, for example? Who are the people training these tools? Are they being paid or not? And also, what is this thing producing for you? For example, is it producing a confidently wrong answer that you might want to think critically about? In the case of tools that generate text, seemingly as if by magic. And so I think it's important for all of us to be asking those types of critical questions, getting into the details as well about how these tools work, because while it may be that some of them are a bit complicated, they are perhaps a bit less complicated than you might think. And the great thing about this area, too, is there's a lot of scholars, myself, but also many others, who've been doing a lot of work to try and break things down so that how AI works is something that we can all understand at least a little bit. So for anyone who's an engaged citizen listening, organizations like Data in Society are great ones to look to for guidance on these issues. And I would encourage everyone to take up those opportunities, because this is how I think we can better engage with these tools. We can figure out what benefits that they might have, but also we can become a bit critical about the drawbacks and the significant, perhaps, losses that might occur when engaging with AI. So I think those are all perfectly valuable questions for us to be asking today and into the future.
I think that's a good way to end, and also a kind of an empowering idea, that it is possible to understand some of this and to have some agency in how we might choose to engage with it. So thank you very much, Professor Raso, for sitting down with me today. New episodes of Mark My Words drop every Wednesday, and you can find us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, or you can watch us on YouTube if you want. You can also subscribe so you don't miss any of our future episodes. Mark My Words is a co-production of McGill University Advancement and Communications and Institutional Relations. Special thanks to my co-host Derek Kassoff and to our producer Frank Roop. And Derek will be back with you next week with a new episode.